Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenforth, and Redbridge's Cos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. Welcome back, Curtinistas. Welcome back to Curtin's Cast, the JCR's podcast of politics, culture and idea. You're joined by myself, Nick Dyrenforth, ED, head honcho of the John Curtin Research Centre, and I'm joined by my great mate, Cos Kung Fu, Cos Samaras. How you going, Cosy?
G'day, mate.
We've got a stunning guest today, the Premier of South Australia, the King of South Australia, the Pride of South Australia, Peter Malinauskas. He's the 47th Premier of South Australia. I don't think I need to give him a long intro. He's very well known, of course, to South Australians, creators. I love using that old-fashioned term. He became Premier of South Australia, the great state of South Australia, in 2022. Obviously has a life outside of politics. He's a devoted husband, married to Annabelle, dad of four. For his sins, he's a passionate Port Adelaide fan, which I love to stir him up about. And a weekend footy player with the Adelaide Uni Blacks. Welcome to Curtin's Cast, Peter Malinauskas.
Thanks very much. It's good to be with the Curtin Research Centre. Good afternoon, Cos, and good to see you again, Nick.
Great to see you. It's been a long time. It's been about three days. Port Adelaide, they nearly won over the weekend, mate.
Yeah, I know, but I was at a work function. I got in the car just in time to watch the last 15 minutes on my phone. And then the heartbreak ensued right before my eyes. I should have stayed at the work function.
I was cheering you on. As you know, I'm a Brisbane.
I don't know how much I believe that.
I'm a Brisbane Lions fan. I was cheering you on because I needed Freo to lose, but you failed me.
The footy season's over as far as I'm concerned. I got 5 weeks of pain in front of me. So anyway.
You're a proud Port supporter. You obviously grew up in Adelaide. You're the grandson of refugees from World War II Europe. I'd forgotten, Pete, just how rich the tapestry of your background is. Malinauskas is obviously Lithuanian surname, but you've got Hungarian, Italian, Irish, and Greek roots with Comrade Cos.
I knew it.
I'd forgotten all about that. Tell us about the fact, I didn't know it was that diverse.
No. So on mum's side, it's all Irish Catholic.
Yep.
So, a bit more of a traditional story there. Good, hard-working people, and grew up in around Peary and Whyalla. And then on dad's side, my grandfather was Lithuanian, so he came out in 1948, fleeing the communists. And then my grandmother came from Hungary in 1949 doing the same thing. And they met in Bonagilla in the displaced persons camp. So is that, where all the displaced people, we would now call them refugees. It was a refugee camp, I guess is the way they describe it, in New South Wales, and they met there.
Up on the border of New South Wales, Victoria.
That's it.
Yep.
They fell in love in a few weeks, worked out they were going to get married, but to get out, you had to have a job. So they put a call out one day and they said, is anyone here a chef? And my grandfather put his hand up and said, yeah, I'm a chef. And they said, righto, we've got a job for you in Woodside in South Australia, just outside of Adelaide, like in the hills. And so he took that up, and of course he'd never cooked a day in his life, but he was willing to take any work he could get to get out, and said to my grandmother, come over to Woodside and we'll get married as quick as you can. So, and there's a bit of a story behind that, but so she did, and the rest is history. So, so it's a bit of a diverse background, and I'm really proud of it, actually.
Yeah, would you describe yourself as a good Catholic? You're obviously, raised in the church, went to, I think, Mercedes College. That's an integral part of your backstory.
Yeah, my faith is important to me. I wouldn't describe myself as a rigid practicing Catholic. Like, I don't get to mass as much as I'd like, but I certainly that sort of social justice ethos, that sort of was sort of drilled into me within my family and at school that has a Catholic tradition, has been really instructive to my view of the world and my politics. I don't think you have to be Christian or religious for that matter to have a social justice-based value system, but certainly that was much of the origins of mine, comes from I guess that Catholic tradition, and like I said, it's really important to me. And
No, it's an important point though, Pete, because as Laborite, we've become much more secular. People of faith,
yeah.
I think it's uncontroversial to say, have over time have started the question, is the ALP the party for us? But I think we've got to find ways of appealing to an incredibly diverse electorate, which looks a lot like your family backstory. And if one of the ways we can appeal to people is speaking to their faith traditions, Catholic social teaching, the influence of Rerum Novarum, the papal encyclical of 1891, if we can speak to them in their language and the way that they understand how faith is connected to social and economic justice, then, to use a footy analogy, we're potentially kicking with the wind in the final quarter.
Something that has, frustrated me a little bit on the progressive side of politics, of which I count myself a member, clearly, we are very quick and quite rightly there to preach the values of tolerance and inclusion and diversity. But sometimes the most strident advocates of those principles all of a sudden seem to be completely at ease denouncing Christianity. And that I find completely perverse. And so, I do think that the secularisation of the progressive side of politics is an objectively reasonable. I think if we're serious about tolerance or inclusion or embracing diversity, then it's also true that we should be accepting people of all faith traditions should have a voice too, and that if their value system, whether it be derived through faith or other means, orientates them towards a progressive policy pursuit or, like a social justice ethos, then that should be welcomed rather than diminished.
A very significant portion of the Labor base is still and remains religious. If we look at whether you're in Adelaide, whether you're in Melbourne or Sydney in particular, if you go to what we would define as naturally Labor's safer territory, it's overwhelmingly more religious than what we will define the emerging sort of progressive diaspora that we sometimes, think about when we think about progressive politics. Yeah. So, I think the Labor side of politics needs to be very careful. I think that's fairly strong sage advice that you're giving there to them, and that is that they've got to be careful about respecting that space. Because, you go out to Melbourne's West, where we come from, and it's religion's on the rise. So the religious epicentre of Melbourne, for example, used to be the eastern suburbs, where the Liberal Party used to have its stronghold. It's now moved to the west. Yeah,
but also in Orthodox churches. I do get a sense that in Orthodox churches there's a graduation towards conservatism, not necessarily because they're becoming more conservative, but because of a sense that they're not welcome under the umbrella of the progressive side of politics. And I find that completely disconcerting, because I feel my faith aligns and the principles and values installed upon me sit squarely on the progressive side of politics than a more traditional conservative side. So, and everything that has happened more recently in terms of what's happening on the right and the extremism that is encroaching on the right, I think should represent a greater shift towards our side of politics and people of faith who care for one another. So, I just think I hope that with time, people in the Labor Party become a little bit more accustomed to practicing a sense of welcome towards people of faith or Christian people of faith than the opposite.
Sure. And we're going to deep dive into that threat from the right and the populist right a little bit later. Tell us about your political evolution. Was the family did you have political conversations around the dinner table? One of the things I like about you is you're honest. You haven't tried to sort of spin some log cabin story about growing up in Adelaide. You come from a middle class family who valued aspiration, hard work, education. You went to work at Woolies at age 15. You started unionising your colleagues, and you later became state secretary of the union who represent retail workers, the SDA. I too, my first union that I was able to join was the SDA. We were about the same age, Pete. It's quite interesting. Back in those days, I worked for a liquor outlet which was owned and run by Coles, still is. I remember the first day I started, my boss, because he's from an ethnic background as well, he gave me a starter pack and he specifically highlighted the SDA union membership form. He said you should fill that out. I don't know if that would happen these days. I used to recruit the youngsters on the floor. So tell us about that. Your political and industrial evolution.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I didn't grow up in a home that was political in a partisan sense. Deeply engaged on current affairs, always inviting a conversation. Well, did you see this? What's your opinion? What do you think about that? And Mum and Dad were very determined to make sure that we felt at ease talking about these types of matters without being partisan in any way. I don't think Mum or Dad, they weren't ever members of a political party. My paternal grandparents, the refugees, they were fiercely conservative. And that was
because of their experiences living under communism. Yeah.
They were exclusively anti-communist, right? And all they were ever going to do was vote for the least. Yeah, exactly. All they were ever going to do was vote for the least communist party they could find.
And I've got two deceased communist grandfathers, but anyway, that's
it's the same impact we saw with the Vietnamese community when it arrived here. Same dynamic, absolutely.
Yeah, but Dad was worked for our public housing trust here in South Australia. That was, and Mum was a librarian, so it was they both worked, and we grew up in a sort of loving household. I'm very grateful for that. And in suburban Adelaide, sort of ground zero, sort of middle class environment, really. But look, I wanted to go to the Royal Show one year, and Mum and Dad said, "Sure, no problems. You got to go get a job to pay for it." So I went and put my name everywhere and got a job at Woolies. And that exact same interaction that you had, Nick, I had with the trainee coordinator at the store, and she said, "You've got to fill out all this paperwork, including the union membership card." And I just took it as a given. I wouldn't have described myself as a young unionist. Mum and Dad certainly wouldn't describe themselves as unionists per se. But I joined the union, didn't think too much of it until a few years later. I saw a few things happen at work, and I guess that's that sense of like injustice. I observed some things were happening to other people, and I decided I'd speak up for them. And that sort of caught the attention of the union itself. I didn't think too much of it at all, to be honest. But I found myself feeling as though that was important. I wasn't anti the company or Woolies. I love Woolies. They were really good to me. It was great while I was at school and uni. But there were just a couple of things. Basically what happened was their women working on the checkouts. They had their whole lives turned upside down because they were given a roster that said they're going to go from working no weekends to working every weekend and working more late nights. And they couldn't do anything about it. And I sort of said, that's a bit unfair. I'm happy to pipe up about that. Your enterprise agreement says that they have to give you more notice and da-da-da-da, and was able to negotiate an outcome. And then the union found out about it, and I got to know the union secretary, and then he offered me a job. And I was really unsure about it. I remember my dad saying, nah, mate, don't. Yeah. And but no, I decided I was going to give it a crack. And within weeks of working at the union, and this was while I was at university at the time, within weeks of working at the union, I knew that I'd found my political ground zero, because the SDA would be characterised as a more moderate union that valued working with employers as much as against them if they were doing something wrong, and that felt very comfortable to me. And it was around about the same time at university I got a sense of my own politics and had formed the view that I was my politics aligned with the Labor Party, but probably the right of the Labor Party. And it just so happened that the union that I've been a member of all these years was at the centre of that organising effort structurally. And I'm very grateful for that opportunity. It was life-changing, and I feel as though, without that sort of serendipity, my contribution would have been very different to what it is.
you become state secretary, touted as a future politician, future leader of the Labor Party, and things happen very quickly. Into Legislative Council in 2015, you become a minister quite quickly. Then, of course, you're thrown back into opposition in 2018 after a very long stint in government.
Yeah.
You become leader of the opposition, and your leadership of the opposition is defined by something which, caused a great interest in COVID. And kind of set the template for how a opposition leader of any political stripe should conduct themselves during COVID.
It was really, I won't lie though, it was really a challenging period because, I took over the leadership of the party after we just lost an election after 16 years in government, and everyone sort of quite reasonably assumed that Labor would be going into opposition for a sustained period. The newly elected Premier had a mandate. Stephen Marshall, he was, he's a articulate performer. He had a majority at the time and plenty of energy and a strong work ethic. I take none of that away from him at all. And so when I took over the leadership of the party, it was a difficult period. But within 2 years, we were ahead in the polls, and we're up 53-47 in a way that stunned everybody. At the very moment that poll came out, in a way that was a bit of a shockwave through South Australian politics, COVID's really started to crank up domestically here in Australia. And I knew instantly that all the work that we had done over the course of that first 2 years had completely evaporated, because it felt like this was a crisis like none other, and that it would undoubtedly elevate the incumbent, which is exactly what happened around the country. Unlike anything we've ever seen before, premiers were overnight became rock stars and central players in the operation of our federation, and everyone was elevated. Regardless, doesn't matter what they were. And part of the reason why they were elevated is because largely premiers, I think, responded well to the pandemic. They acted rationally on the basis of the best advice they could receive at the time, which is what the community wanted. And that sort of completely changed the political dynamic. But what I observed was opposition leaders in other places not treating it like the emergency that it was. And the analogy I used internally within my show was, this is like a bushfire.
That's right.
No one wants to see opposition leaders out during the course of a bushfire criticising people doing their level best under difficult circumstances. How does that help? And so we basically said we would look at other opposition leaders around the country that were doing this and decide to do the exact opposite. And we backed the government in a way that the community wanted us to, right? If the government was doing their level best in difficult circumstances and acting reasonably, then back them in. So that's what we did. It relegated us, don't get me wrong, because if an opposition leader calls a press conference and says, I hereby support the government, they're less likely to be on the news. But at least when we were on the news, we were acting as responsible leaders, and people want to see people working together in an emergency. So we did that. But at the same time, we had a clear eye on understanding that by the time the election came around, if we preserved our credibility and demonstrated acting in the public interest rather than our political interest, then they might be open to hearing about what our plans would be if we were in charge.
That's absolutely cool.
Yeah, and that was our plan, and fortunately, it worked out.
Yeah, that response was absolutely critical, because what the Conservatives in Victoria did not understand when they acted exactly like as if it was just another day in politics was that it was a bushfire. And it was a crisis that people just wanted to live through and get through it to the other end. They may have mixed views about the lockdowns and so on in Victoria, but they just desperately wanted everyone to be an adult. And then when you come out of a crisis and you start as an opposition trying to get people's attention, they're going to listen to you because you were an adult when they want you to be.
Yeah.
Contrast between how you handle it and how the Victorian opposition in Victoria handle it could not be greater.
Yeah, I saw Michael O'Brien and every day just sort of smashing the government up. And I just think that ultimately that was at the expense of their own credibility in the electorate's mind. But look, I mean, these things are always easier said than done.
Oh, no, you're being given advice.
Yeah.
You did it.
But it was a really challenging period and for the whole community. And if people were seen to be putting their own political interests ahead of the state's interests, then you're going to get punished for it. I mean, in one respect, it's not rocket science.
It's hard. It's so 5 years ago now since it kicked off. I just had a flashback, apart from the mask, etc., and then having to cancel international travel. Like one of the most shocking moments, I just had a flashback ingrained in my mind, is that the footage on TV of those queues snaking around the streets, people trying to get into Centrelink.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and there are so many other images you can think about. But when that happened, and I remember looking at that line, right? And if you're a person who's in that line, the only thing you want to know is that everyone that's in charge of running the joint is working as hard as they can to get them back to work, right? That's all, and be able to provide for their families. And if they saw me on television as an opposition leader contributing to the problem, they're justified in marking us down for that.
Absolutely. They were disproportionately in their 20s, right across the country, and in the early 30s. And who does, the conservative side of politics have the biggest problem with right now?
Yeah.
These voters.
Yeah. They gave you a tick, Melly, and you led Labor to a historic victory at the March 2022 state election. The first opposition leader to oust an incumbent since the beginning of COVID, Premier Chris Minns, who took a similar approach to you in New South Wales, did so, I think, a year afterwards. What has surprised you about the job? You've got the top job, South Australian politics. You're regarded as popular, regarded as inclusive, grounded. What surprised you most?
There's not too many things.
Because you've been in government.
Yeah. Yes, but the difference between it being the Premier and a Minister is huge in respect to being constantly inundated with demands and getting pulled in a million different directions. And without doubt, the thing I find most challenging is how best to allocate my time between addressing the priorities of the day and the moment. And we've got a few challenges here at the moment with the algal bloom. That's an unprecedented and unique event. Versus making sure you're keeping an eye on what are the structural reforms you want to bring through the government or the economy that sets you up for the long term. And that constant tension between attending to people's needs in every respect, like constantly calling on your time, versus wanting to do the work that you want to do to lead the state and as Premier, that just how hard that tension is, or how hard that balancing act and how strong that tension is, that is just an enduring challenge, and the weight of which it's hard to describe without actually being in the role. You can anticipate it and understand it conceptually, but once you're actually in a diary meeting and you've got 5 things you want to say yes to at a particular time in a day, working out which one you say no to is hard.
And we're glad you said yes to us. You're a busy man, and we appreciate you coming on.
But it's an interesting challenge. Like I think about it a lot. And I've spoken to people who have done the job a bit, both sides of politics, that I've got regard for, and they often cite that challenge of time to think. Wishing they just had dispensed with the issues of the day a little bit more and thought about what they want to use the office and the authority that it brings to achieve. They lament not having more of that time because they're just constantly getting inundated. It's a perennial challenge, because I think anyone that is able to assume an office like this one wants to be able to use the authority that is invested in you to make change rather than just respond to a crisis and or crises, which are, there's always one somewhere. So it's a really difficult challenge that I'm still grappling with.
Speaking of challenges, what keeps you up at night? Actually, I think you're a relaxed character. I think I get the sense that you sleep quite well now. But what keeps you up at night? I didn't realise your family had a link with Whyalla. We had the collapse of Whyalla Steelworks. You've been big on the impact on social media on children and young people, and advocating for a ban. What keeps Peter Malinauskas up at night? What do you think the big challenge is for your state and our great country?
Well, all those things you just cited worry me, but you can find, lots of those challenges that are, you can put a circle around or a ring around and contemplate what could I do to make a difference in that area. That's not what stresses me out too much. The big picture things are the ones that really worry me at the moment. I am concerned about the geopolitical environment we're in and what might play out there. I think we are in a really precarious position globally. Now, that sounds a bit sort of, highfalutin or whatever, but I think it's more real than what we often give credit for. And what's happening in places like Wyler and Peoria, in no small part connected to that,
Yes.
through some of the industrial policies that have been deployed for sovereign capability purposes, particularly in China. I think, and I also worry about the state of democracy at the moment to be able to handle those challenges with the mass disruption we see in liberal democracies throughout the West. Less so in Australia, but they're acute in North America and Europe, East and West, and the UK. I worry about all of that because the one thing we haven't had really since the GFC is a massive economic shock. There was what happened in COVID, but governments responded and there wasn't a global economic calamity. But if there was one of those, in a febrile political environment with massive geopolitical tension where there are wars in parts of the world we haven't seen them for a long time, how will that play out is a very concerning proposition when I think about our kids' future. Now, and I worry about it because, clearly it's completely beyond my control. So anyway, but if I was to be more insular and think about the immediate challenges at home, well, I see more opportunity in our state than I see risk. But I think one of the things that's playing out, though, is this challenge of if we want living standards to improve, this challenge of what is happening around work and the modernisation of work, particularly with the advent of AI, I think is something that we need to be thinking pretty heavily about and how we respond to it. There's got to be massive productivity opportunities with AI, but there's also going to be material risks. And regulating this particular space, I think will be more difficult than other technologies that have come before. I think there's a way through it. I'm not an AI pessimist, but I just think there's a challenge before us that's worth a bit more effort and discussion.
I think you make a good point. Politics cannot leave AI to its own devices. It has to be involved. People like yourself have to represent the constituencies which are going to be impacted by AI, either in a negative way, but also in a positive way. I think we've discussed this on the podcast over the last few weeks, and that is that one of the criticisms I have about some of the political class is that they think that it's just something you should not touch, should never be regulated, should be no conversation about it whatsoever. And I think that's just akin to basically turning the tap off in the 1980s and doing nothing about globalisation.
So let's take social media as an example of this. I was of the view that social media would be great because it would have it would contribute to a democratisation of people's sources of information and news.
The global village.
And there was an awful amount of aspiration around this, right? Those of us who might be frustrated about the lack of diversity in the news that they get from the mainstream media, we thought social media would be great. People will be able to find out more and so on. And so we let it go completely unregulated. Like no one's regulating Facebook or TikTok or Instagram or Twitter. They're completely unregulated spaces. And where are we now? Well, they are unquestionably contributors to a worse political discourse based in more disinformation than what was the case before they came along. And I don't think the advent of social media is at all, disconnected to the huge political disruption that we're seeing globally in a way that is not healthy for the outcomes of working people and our society more broadly. So fast forward to where we are. So I think with hindsight, we can look back and say, maybe we should have been contemplating how we're going to tackle that challenge in a regulatory sense. Now, I'm not saying, now, of course, that's a very difficult question to answer because we don't want to, impose upon freedom of speech or expression of opinion, clearly. But by ignoring the challenge, we've got ourselves into a worse position than what we were. The same will be true with AI. We should embrace the AI opportunity. It's a big one in my state, right, for a few reasons about some of the skill sets we've got here. But we've got to do that concurrently with being alive to the risks and just working out how we at least embrace an environment or a discourse that might turn our minds to full regulation or monitoring while embracing the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I don't know whether your staff let you go on TikTok, Peter. It's crazy. It's crazy, and like once you go on, then you we've you and I've got 3 kids. You've got 4 kids. Then you go, wow. Then you can understand why you took that bold, forward-leading action. And one of the things which concerns me, Peter, is particularly I've got a 14-year-old son. Spends a lot of time online watching YouTube videos, TikTok, et cetera, and there's a big debate
for a couple more months.
Well, that's the question is some people say you can't actually ban it and they'll find a way around it. My son's quite a bright young man, doesn't listen to Curtin's cast, but one day he might not be embarrassed about his old man. But one of the things people are concerned about, particularly on our side of politics, is the impact that social media, these silos, the influence of influencers such as Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan is in some ways quite moderate compared to really extreme male influencers, your Andrew Tates of the world, and the things we spoke to the global head of Movember a few weeks ago. We've got a lot of young men are very confused. They've grown up as digital natives, so they've known nothing else, and they're getting their source of news. They're asking basic questions. What does it mean to be a good man in 2025 and the 2020s and beyond? They're getting this advice. They're getting advice about how do you date a girl, et cetera, et cetera. They're getting this from often quite toxic male influences. Precisely the opposite of the role models that you and I, would like to see ourselves as. And it's a problem politically because these people, almost 99% of them, are associated with this surging populist hard right politics, which is often very xenophobic, outwardly racist, deeply problematic, often misogynist views about women. And it's a problem for our side of politics. How do we speak to these young men?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the challenges of our age. And I think nature abhors a vacuum. I mean, I think a vacuum was created around, male leadership or talking about males being different because boys and girls are different. That's always been true. And once we sort of stop celebrating those differences and acknowledging the way we talk to young fellas might be different otherwise. Once that stopped happening and we seem to be only focusing on one gender versus another, the far right have walked straight into that vacuum and tried to commandeer the space. And it's exceptionally dangerous, in my view. And I worry that, I think there's a risk that if we aren't culturally connected to young men and their interests, or let's put it another way. If we're seen to be culturally disconnected from them, then they won't listen to us on anything else because we wouldn't represent what they're interested in. And I don't know why we would consciously allow that to happen.
Because the thing about Trump and the MAGA movement, they don't offer any solutions for these young, aggrieved men, and particularly men from working class backgrounds, but they appear culturally connected and they say, we hear you and we see you.
I've never won an argument talking down to someone.
Yeah.
I've never won an argument calling someone stupid or an idiot. Someone else might have. I don't know. Yeah, but if we want to persuade people, which is what politics, that's a pretty important tool of the trade, is persuading people. You've got to do it in a way that sort of welcomes them into hearing your worldview. Now, if you start from a position of using the word toxic before masculinity all of the time, or if that's all they hear, regardless of whether or not you're using it all the time, then you automatically got someone offside. And that term toxic masculinity, although I am the first to acknowledge that toxic masculinity exists, just look at Andrew Tate as an example. But if you're seen to only ever been talking about masculinity in the context of it being toxic, I think you lose a lot of people from the get-go because masculinity isn't toxic at its best. And I just worry that sometimes the language we use toward, in regards to masculinity is a bit pejorative, and then we become culturally disconnected. And then then I don't know what hope people really place on expecting people to listen to what we have to say.
I think it's important for the progressive side of politics to just be aware that this canvas is not completely painted yet. So there's still an opportunity for this trajectory to be altered. I think, Senator Pocock, for example, spent the campaign, he's obviously an independent, but spent the campaign in gyms to actually talk to young men. And I'm sure, given your past times, you'll be very much familiar with that environment, right? Which is, there is an explosion of young men going to gyms, and that's their culture. That's what they feel comfortable in. That's how they get confidence in themselves about the way they look and the way they feel. And the political class engaging with them in that space, I think, is one way of doing it. I think the answer is the left has to go to where they are.
Yeah, I think that's right. I know that sometimes footy clubs aren't always home to the best behaviour. And I've been privy, particularly in my younger years, privy to, being in the locker room or in the change rooms after a game, and some pretty sort of out there jokes happening and so forth. But I think but when you go so far that people feel uncomfortable just being able to have a laugh at their own expense, then again, you become dislocated from people. I just worry our side of politics has sometimes commandeered, righteousness or the pontification of certain principles at the expense of just being human sometimes. I don't know if I'm articulating, maybe I'm choosing my words a bit carefully here, but I just think sometimes, a bit of banter and a bit of a laugh at each other's expense is part of who we are. And if we're just a bit too pious, then we can lose people. It's just about a balance.
It's about common sense, Peter. It's about common sense, I think. Yeah. I think most people...
That's another way of putting it, yeah.
Yeah, and I think most people in the space... I actually think most people in the mainstream are in the space where you're at. And a lot of what we're talking about is happening on the... We're talking about progressive politics in homogenous terms, but it's generalising things. A lot of it's happening on the margins, the fringes, but they're often the noisiest voices from left and right.
And they're lies in the opportunity, because where we stand is we want to populate the political mainstream.
Yep.
So we just have to act in concert with where the mainstream is and make it perfectly clear where the opportunity presents itself, that far left and far right, well, that is not us, and actively denunciate it. And I actually have a bit of optimism that the tide is turning here. I mean, I actually think now, like when people hear the whole woke thing, they turn off, and that's been true for a while. But I also think now the whole anti-woke thing is just so permanently outraged, and that people are starting to turn off that as well. And I think people are just becoming increasingly disinterested in the noise of being woke or anti-woke, and they just want to know who in political leadership is occupying the common sense, right? And people will graduate towards that naturally. So while 2 years ago or 3 or 4 years ago, I was really fearful that the woke brigade were destroying the centre left because they were occupying too much of the noise from their extreme position, I now also think it's true that the anti-woke brigade is progressively destroying mainstream conservative political discourse. So maybe that's an opportunity.
That's right. You speak to most young people, and we've done that for a number of projects, young men in particular, obviously. And we say, what do you think of that, the far left and the far right in this debate on this issue? And they just go, well, that's just a bit weird.
Yes.
Right?
Well, because they are.
The response is, all they're doing is just screaming at us. Yeah. And then they go, what about the other side? They're doing the same. They're a bit weird. And so I think you're right. There is this growing sense that the fringes got pretty loud voices, but they come across as a bit cultish.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Now, the question is, why isn't that then translating to higher votes for mainstream political parties? That. I'll be interested to see whether or not that plays out, because throughout the West, and even here, it would have been inconceivable 2 elections ago that Labor could win 90 seats in the Parliament, which is a magnificent majority on any objective assessment. But with the primary vote of what do we get? 35%. I mean, that's unbelievable. So it will be interesting to see whether or not there is a graduation back towards mainstream political parties if that sentiment is where people are at.
We're running out of time. You're a very busy man. I need to ask you two final questions. One, because I'd get in trouble because I asked the other side of politics a very similar question. There'll be many people, our regular Curtinistas, but other people tuning in for the first time, who have listened to the last 40 minutes. They've heard a highly intelligent, articulate political leader. Also, and I'll see on the social media grabs you're described in some circles as a sex symbol. No. Those same people would say, why don't you expand your horizons? Because you've often been touted as having a future in federal politics. Can you rule out forever and ever that you wouldn't make the move to Canberra? Are you happy there being the king of South Australia?
No, I'm not far from the king. No. Oh, look, I was really fortunate. I did sort of have an opportunity to go into federal politics, and I was actively engaged on the national executive and national executive committee, and enjoyed working on those federal campaigns. I've got a lot of good friends in the federal parliament, and that's where things were sort of going. But then at the last minute, sort of a few things happened that I was persuaded to come into the state parliament instead, and it was a really difficult choice at the time, but the best decision I ever made. And I don't look at that call with any regret whatsoever. And I don't say that just because I'm fortunate enough to be premier. It's just a view I've had, because I do think state politics has got a lot of virtues to it in terms of your proximity to people.
Yeah,
and its ability to be able to give you. I think that, well, for me anyway, I can't speak for others, but for me, that I think I make better judgments just because I spend more. I'm able, just by virtue of living here and getting out and living a slightly more normal life than being on a plane all the time, getting a bit of a sense of where people are at and what they're looking for. I don't know if my judgment would be as good if I was denied that ability by having to travel as much as you do going to Canberra. So I made a call on this some time ago, and I'm very grateful that I did.
I think that's as close as to a never ever ruling out as we're going to get you to make. And you're doing great things to South Australia. Gather round. I'm definitely coming over next year to gather round. What a spectacular part of the AFL calendar. You've got the golf. You've got the motorsports. It's all happening in South Australia.
Those things are good, but what's more important to me is we've finally got the fastest housing growth in the nation at the moment. I think housing, we haven't spoken about housing, but housing's the one that I think is really dangerous. When we're talking about those big picture issues before, I think the intergenerational equity piece in a both a social economic sense, but also in a political economy sense, is really dangerous. And I'm really happy that the state's economy is sort of up and about in a way we haven't seen for a while, and now we can translate that to some dividends and housing growth. But anyway, that's going to sound like a politician speaking, but it is really bloody important.
You're going to get a lot of 20-something-year-olds from Sydney moving to Adelaide very quickly because they can't afford to live in Sydney.
I hope that's true, because we need the workers desperately, in fact. There's a whole range of skills that we just can't train people fast enough up for. So to the extent there's anyone from Victoria or Sydney or anywhere else that wants to come across, get on board.
Listen, mate, if I wasn't sort of bedded down with the family, I make the observation every time I get to go over to Adelaide 3 or 4 times a year. I think it's a great place to live, despite you being South Australians and home of the Adelaide and Port Power football clubs. And so finally, this little softball question to finish, Melanie. I'm asking this because as an ex-footballer, and I've been limping around with tendonitis in my right knee, my left ankle, which I tore to shreds in my career, is also playing up. Have you finally retired from the Adelaide Uni Blacks? Do those 20-somethings from Sydney or Melbourne, will they be able to come over to South Australia and see you pull on the Adelaide Uni Black Guernsey, play amateur footy?
I can't say I played my last game, but I've definitely played my last season. So, and the last time I played, we were in an elimination final, and if people saw me play, they probably would have gone in the car and drove straight back home, considering how badly I played. But the phone started ringing in July because there must have been a few injuries to get me back out, but I just couldn't make it work-wise. But I don't know, like in my mind, I haven't stopped playing, but I think
the mind is willing, but
the body not so much.
Graying up against reality.
I really miss it. I got to say, it's the one thing about this job that I've sort of had to sort of stop I really miss it. It's just that half an hour, and you'll appreciate this, but that half an hour, 45 minutes after a game when you're sitting in the rooms and, moments that were hangers when in actual fact you're only off the ground by that much and you're talking all the rubbish and giving each other a heap of grief. I really miss that camaraderie.
I was actually looking this week, Pete. It's 30 years since I played in 2 grand finals in 1 week, and this is where I actually did damage to my left ankle ligaments. It's like 30 years ago. Two premierships in 1 week, and those I don't have internet social media photos, but looking back, it's a really special time. And just looking at the photos of in the rooms afterwards, it's a special thing. And I really miss it. But my son's into it now, so I have to live vicariously through Walkerville Cats under 8s. Well, that's what I'm doing with my boy Micah, and I can tell you, Pete, he's your height. He's tall.
Well, there we go.
He's an inch and a half taller than me, and he's 14.
Can he have a beer in the rooms yet, or is he still too young?
No. I'm going there. And he's more of a cricketer than a footballer.
Okay, yeah.
Peter Malinauskas, it's been fantastic chatting with you. It's been really generous with your time today. You're a busy man. Good luck. You've got a state election coming up next year. Am I correct? I'm very confident that the good burghers, the good public of South Australia.
There's never know in politics. Things change quickly. Cos can tell you that. So
that's true.
I know. You've been described as a perennial paranoid, but I think that's a good thing to be in politics.
You've got to be a bit paranoid. Yep.
Thanks, Melly. Thanks, Kung Fu Cos. Thanks, Curtinistas. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. We'll catch you next week on Curtin's Cast. Ciao and arrivederci.